Welcome, everyone. My name is David Chandler. I work with the Google Web Toolkit team in Atlanta. And today, John LaBanca and I are going to be talking about some ways to improve the performance of your GWT apps. I want to acknowledge at the outset here, we recognize that we're competing with another great GWT session across the hall, the game programming session with Phil Rogers and Ray Cromwell. And we'd like to be there too, because they're doing some cool stuff. So I promise to do at least one cool visual demo for you during this talk so you can get something, some eye candy out of it. So we're going to talk first about why does speed matter, just some interesting numbers related to your page load times and exit times. We'll look at 5 performance pitfalls. A few of these you may have seen from previous I/O conferences, and then there's some new stuff as well. Then we'll talk about John will talk about the new cell widgets in GWT 2.1 and following. We'll look at activities and places and code splitting as a technique to improve your application's performance. And then finally, some compiler tips at the end of our talk. So first of all, why does speed matter? This is an interesting graph from wikia.com. They measured the exit rate at their site versus the load time and showed that as the load time approached 5 seconds, they would lose up to 20% of their users. Now, Google did a test once upon a time of this same thing, and we had more dramatic numbers. People asked for 30 search results instead of 10, and that increased the load time half a second for the first page of search results. And what we measured in small experiments was that over a 6-week period, that resulted in a 25% decline in the first page search results. So that would be about $2.5 billion at the time the test was conducted in revenue for Google. So we were quite concerned about that, and we did not go out with 30 search results. That's why you still see 10 as the default on your page today. So let's talk about some performance pitfalls. The first one related to this is don't lose the user at startup. HTTP requests is the slowest thing you can do in the browser. There's no JavaScript operation that takes as long as going to the server and back. So one of the techniques which has been around in GWT for quite a while is to use client bundle to minimize trips for images and CSS resources. Chris Ramsdale showed that technique in more detail in his talk this morning on mobile. But basically, it's a simple interface where you can combine all of your images and resources together, and then GWT will make only one trip to the server and split them all out on the client instead of making individual requests for each image and CSS. Another technique you can do is to prefetch data that's needed by your first page at load time. So one easy way to do this is instead of hosting your GWT app in a static HTML page, you can host it in a JSP page, for example. And then any data that your GWT app is going to need right off the bat, you just write in as JavaScript variables into the host page. And then you can use the GWT dictionary class to read those JavaScript variables from your GWT app. Or you can use JSNI methods as well to do that. We've recently written an article on this on the GWT code site that you can check out and get more info on that technique. Okay, a second big performance pitfall is don't lock up the browser. JavaScript is single-threaded, and so you don't want the browser to become unresponsive to user input. And that means you have to be careful when writing your GWT code. So scheduler is the new feature that replaces the timer feature in the older versions of GWT. And there's a method schedule deferred that will wait until the browser event loop runs, and then it will run your code after that. So this, instead of just doing everything in line in your GWT code, if you occasionally use schedule deferred to defer some operations, then that will give users a chance to respond. This is sometimes also required as a workaround for focus on layout issues. Some of the widgets, like I know a text box, if you call set focus true on it, then it may not actually take effect in some browsers until after the event loop runs. So you have to use schedule deferred, set focus true, and then it will happen. Okay, for repetitive UI work, similarly here, you don't want to use a for loop to do, say, an animation frame, because that would make the browser completely unresponsive to user input. So instead, you're going to have a while loop, and then for each frame, the command to draw frame, you would put in a schedule fixed period for example, and that would execute it once every 5, 10, 15 milliseconds, however often you specify. There's also a method that's useful in the scheduler called schedule_finally that will execute code before the browser repaint event loop runs. And this is good for coalescing calls. So if you had several calls that manipulate the DOM, for example, then you could use schedule_finally to have them all run together. And that would reduce flicker as well as limit the amount of actual DOM activity that's required in the browser. Okay, number 3, don't make 2 trips when one will do. What we're talking about here is batching of calls to the server. So with GWT you can do this using the command pattern, and there's lots of frameworks out there for that. GWT dispatch, actually there's a few frameworks for that, but GWT dispatch is one that's been very popular. Lets you send nouns or commands to the server rather than having to call service methods directly. And by doing that, you can queue up your commands and then send them all at once to the server. And I've written a couple articles on my blog about using GWT dispatch to do that. Or you can now use Request Factory, which is our new RPC capability in GWT. And Request Factory has built-in batching support. So with GWT 2.3, you just call request context dot whatever your method is, and instead of calling fire immediately, you call the .to method, and then after all of those are accumulated, then you call .fire, and that just makes one trip to the server. With GWT 2.4, which the beta came out this week, you could actually do this across services as well, using the request context.append method. So that's a good way, again, to minimize the chattiness of your application to the server and thereby improve its responsiveness. Number 4, watch out for RPC type explosion. So this one affects not so much runtime performance as compile time. Basically, RPC, because it supports polymorphism, will generate a serializer and deserializer for each concrete type of an interface in an inheritance hierarchy. And so you end up with, if you have large inheritance hierarchies, you end up with lots of serializers and deserializers. And that takes a lot of time to the compile process. It also increases the size of your JavaScript download unnecessarily in some cases. So our recommendation here is to prefer concrete types to interfaces when you're using RPC. So ordinarily in Java, you would use a list rather than an array list specifically, but it turns out it's better for RPC if you're sending that over the wire, you should actually just use the array list unless you really do need to make it at some point other types of lists. You can also blacklist RPC types so that no code will be generated for those if you know you're not going to use them. And the details on that, you can look on the GWT issue tracker in 4438. We need better documentation, but I needed something quick for this slide, so there you have it. Also consider Request Factory instead. This is the new RPC layer, and it will support polymorphism. It's not there yet, but it will support it in a way that doesn't cause these type explosions, because Request Factory doesn't have to generate a serializer and deserializer for every class like RPC does. And finally, for the performance pitfalls, number 5, don't use a widget when HTML will do. Widgets have overhead due to the event processing that's required in the browser. And anytime you add an event handler, then that's taking up memory and it's slowing down the browser a little bit. So don't use widgets unless you actually do need to respond to events from that widget. If you're just trying to write HTML onto the page, then just use plain HTML instead. And you can do that easily using UI Binder with HTML tags. But there is a caution here. If you do need to catch an event at some deeply nested place in the widget hierarchy, it does have to have a path consisting only of widgets back up to the top. So you can't do, say, all of your layout in HTML at a top level and then have HTML, 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 and then try to attach a widget to listen for events, because they won't bubble up. So if you do need them at a low level, then you should be using widgets all the way up. Also, you can use the new layout panels. They're more efficient than previous panels were. because they delegate more to the browser and they make less use of tables. So we're using more CSS layout now. And now for lists and tables and trees especially, we recommend that you use the new cell widgets instead of the old flex table and grid. Those approaches, each cell was a widget, but with cell widgets, as John will come and tell us, it's a much lighter weight pattern. So John Labanka, please come and tell us about cell widgets.
Thank you. All right. So for those of you who aren't familiar, we recently, as of GWT 2.2, I believe, we introduced this new concept of cells and cell widgets. So what I'm going to talk about today is what is a cell and how does it compare to a widget. And then we're going to go into and talk about cell table, what it is, why it's so awesome, and how to use it. There are other cell widgets. There's a cell tree, cell list, but cell table has by far gotten the most use, so we're going to focus on that. Okay, so cell widgets are cells are like widget flyweights. A widget creates its DOM structure using DOM calls and create element, and then builds itself and syncs events on itself. All that is fairly expensive when you do a lot of it. A cell, on the other hand, you create one instance, as you can see in the little chart below. That one instance generates HTML strings. It can create multiple DOM elements from those strings. Anytime an event occurs on one of those elements, it goes back to the flyweight, and you get the event, and you get the parent DOM element. The benefits of this, as Dave mentioned, widgets have overhead, so there's a lot less overhead. And you can render large sets, such as an entire table, as a single HTML string. OK, so some of the features that are currently supported, we support paging, multiple row selection, keyboard navigation and row selection, column sorting, and the rest of them. And what we're hoping to add by the end of this quarter is a fixed header and footer with a scrollable content area in the center, and also a fully customized table structure. So row spans, col spans. You can do things like have expandable rows by just creating multiple rows and indexing everything past the first row. So here's a little demo. Now the demo I'm doing here, this is the Google Web Toolkit Showcase app that has been available for a long time. So I'm going to do a few things. I'm going to click and do multi-selection. I can navigate using the cursors. And you can see it's skipping non-editable cells. I can click and change a value. And then I can do paging. So you can see how fast this table pages. Basically as fast as I can click on it. And column sorting. All right, so we had a little overview. Now let's talk about how you actually create one of these cell tables. So basically, creating the cell table widget, very easy. You create the widget, and then you add columns. Create a widget. You'll notice that here we've typed it with the type contact. That's the row value, the value that goes across all the columns. Each column will have its own genericized type that represents either a field or a group of fields in the row. The simplest column is a text column. It's of type string, so you don't need to add the extra type. And what you basically do is you provide this getValue method, which says, get me the column value from the row value. So object or contact.name. For something slightly more complicated, we use a date. So a date cell is a cell that will represent a date. You can customize the format of the date object. And what we say is the column is of type contact and date. So from a column row object, get the date. And that's exactly what this getValue method does. All right, pretty straightforward. How do we put data into the cell table? The simplest version is what you see here. You take a list of data, and you call setRowData, and boom, your data will appear in your cell table. But that's really only useful if you have static data. You just want to render a large set, but it's not dynamic. So a more practical use case involves a data provider. Now, the data provider is not a required class. It's a convenience class. What it's really doing is the cell table can fire range change events. And so it's listening for the range change events, getting the data for the new range, and providing it. But you'll find that these data providers are a little bit easier to use for some of that setup logic. So we're going to create an asynchronous data provider. I'll get to it in 1 second. And then we're going to add the table as a display of that data provider. Multiple tables, and you can, tables and lists, you can use them jointly, can have the same data provider providing data for them. So you don't have to manage multiple requests for the same data. OK. On-range change is called when the table is loaded and when the user pages. So if they're paging through, the range here is going to start, let's say, 0 through 50, then it will go 51 through 100. At this point, you can send a RPC request, or whatever you need to do, to get the data from the server. When it comes back, you call update row data with the new data. One of the cool features about Cell Table is that it supports a push model. So you can send the request for the first 20 rows, then the next 20 rows, then the next 20 rows, and just update the data incrementally. So you don't have to wait for a very long RPC call to get something in front of the user. In addition to async data provider, we also provide list data provider, which is even simpler. You don't have to implement anything. It is a data provider backed by a Java util.list, and any modifications you make to the list are reflected in the table. All right. So you've got your table, you've got the data in your table. How do you make modifications? What we support is each column has a field updater. And the field updater is called when the user interacts with a cell. So if it's a button cell and the user clicks the button, it calls the field updater. And the parameters that are passed to update, there's the index and general stuff. The contact here is an unmodified row value. The date, the new birthday, is the new column value. So if it's a text field, the new birthday would be the new text. What we do is we call our RPC service. We send it the row value and the new data. And then on success, we knew that it's been a successful change. We call contact.setBirthday. We update our local cache, however you store that, and redraw the table. And so what this model provides, in the meantime, your cell can go into a pending state if you want it to. You can do a lot of different things. And when we redraw, because Cell Table is so fast, even if you have 50 rows and 10 columns, you should be able to redraw so fast that it doesn't matter that you're redrawing the whole table. If you have a very large table and you want to make sure that you only redraw that one value, you want to optimize for performance, instead of redrawing the whole table, you can push that new value to the table by calling setRowData with a singleton list. The key here, the reason this isn't the obvious first choice, is that in the asynchronous RPC call, the index could change. So if the user deletes a row while you're updating another row, the index will be off. So you have to manage that in your own app logic, and for some it will be easier than others, but this is an optimization. And with that, I will hand it back to Dave, who's going to talk about code splitting and activities in places.
Thanks, John. So GWT 2.1 released a new application framework that used activities and places. And we want to cover that this afternoon, whatever time it is. It's been a long couple of months. In order to help you understand how you can use it with code splitting. Code splitting, you're probably familiar with, the gwt.runAsync. This is a way to break your application up into parts of JavaScript, individual scripts, where each one only gets loaded as it's actually needed. And this can dramatically improve the load time of your application by reducing the amount of code needed on the first page. So what I'm going to show you here is how to use activities in places, and then we'll look at how to use activities in places with code splitting specifically. So activities in places helps you manage history, your browser's history, bookmarks, and the evil back button. What happens if you are building a web app, and it's an AJAX app, it's mostly JavaScript, and unless you do something special in your app, what happens when the user comes up and clicks the back button? Your app goes away, because it goes back to whatever page they were on, right? So users don't think that's the way applications should work, and so GWT has had for a long time in it the history object, which lets you put a token on the URL, and there's a special little iframe that you put in your host page that listens for events, listens for changes to the browser history, and then can update the state of your application. It's been difficult to use history directly. It takes a little more thought. And so there are lots of frameworks that emerged, MVP frameworks, like GWT Presenter and GWT Platform, that will do this history management for you through the notion of places. Well, now we have our own notion of places in GWT itself. And you might ask, what does this have to do with Model View Presenter? So there's been some confusion about this, and I apologize for this. Some of the confusion is our fault because we originally conflated some concepts. And the MVP pattern, strictly speaking, View and Presenter, doesn't have anything to do with place and history management. However, those two topics were originally presented together on this stage a couple years ago in the same presentation. And so people began to commonly refer to MVP as place history management as well. And it turns out that framers like GWT Presenter and GWT Platform, it actually makes a lot of sense and is very convenient if you've defined a presenter in your app to just be able to annotate and have it take on the notion of place as well and have the framework automatically handle the URL transitions when you navigate to and from a place. With activities and places now, though, I'm going to separate those concepts. We're not talking about MVP proper here. We're talking about browser history management. Okay, let's do a quick demo of places in action here so you can see this. This is the expenses sample app, which is in the GWT trunk. And it uses places. So you'll notice the URL here, we're just at our load page, expenses.html. But when I click on one of these detail items, the URL changes. And now we have some ID and a full class name in there. Okay, that's our place. It's in response to a place change. So if I bookmark this place, we'll just copy it to the clipboard here and pull up a new browser tab and copy that in, and then go directly there. It loads our app and takes us immediately to that place. That's what we're talking about with the notion of places. So how do we make this work in GWT 2.1 and following? Okay, first some definitions. A place just represents a bookmarkable state. A place controller is a GWT class that makes the back button and bookmarks work like you expect. It's what actually does the interaction with the GWT history object. And a place tokenizer is something that you write that tells GWT how do I convert from the state of my Java object to a string that can be put on the URL, or conversely, from that string back to the Java object representing a place. So here's an example of a place. This one extends the place class, which is now in GWT. And the main part of it really is the tokenizer. The two methods are required. We have getPlace and getToken. And these just, you tell GWT how to translate the Java to a string and vice versa. That's basically it for places. It's very simple. It is a little bit of boilerplate. It would be nice if we would generate these tokenizers automatically, and you can expect to see future work related to that down the road. Some of the other frameworks like GWT Presenter use annotations and then GWT generators in order to take care of this for you, and it would be nice if we did something similar in GWT. How do you tell GWT about all of your places in your app? You do that using a place history mapper. This is a simple marker interface. It has no actual methods or code in it, but the annotation with tokenizers is where you point to the tokenizer class for each place in your app. You just list them all out, and then GWT automatically registers them in its infrastructure. The place history mapper is the interface that you extend, and there's also a factory version of this called place history mapper with factory. And if your tokenizers require arguments in their constructors, then you'll need to use the factory version instead of this interface. Okay, let's look at the moving parts. What actually happens here? Let's say you want to cause the view to transition, go to a new place. So you call the placeController.goTo method. That results in a place change event being fired. It goes to the event bus. The place history handler, which is a GWT class, listens for that event, and then it calls history.newItem, which actually puts the URL on the browser's address bar. Going backwards, when the user uses the back button or goes to a bookmark, That causes the history value change event to be fired. The place history handler picks that up, calls placeController.goTo, the new place, and effects the place transition. Okay, places are designed to be used with activities. They don't have to be, but it's useful. So if you don't use them with activities, you would have to listen for these place change events in your app yourself, and then change the view however you need to based on those events. But if you use the activities, then there's a little more stuff that GWT will do for you. So the terminology is taken from Android development. An activity just represents something that the user is doing. We say it handles wake up, set up, and show up. So it's kind of managing the state of the user's actions with respect to a particular part of the UI. So one of the nice features of activities is that they can automatically warn users before leaving. So if they use the back button, let's say, a warning box will pop up and says, this activity is stopping. Do you really want to stop? And you can control the message, of course. If you have multiple activities running on your screen, we'll look at an example of that in a minute, then all of those activity stop messages will just get appended to a single warning box. Now, activities are started and stopped by an activity manager, and you have one activity manager per panel on your screen. So you can have multiple activities going all at the same time. They take care of instantiating the view for a particular area of the screen, and they can be presenters in MVP parlance, but they don't have to be. It's really intended to be a higher level concept. But an activity can be associated with a place as well. We'll look at that all in a minute in a big, complicated diagram. So here is a typical activity. This extends the abstract activity, which is just a convenience class. The real requirement is just to implement the activity interface, but this class provides default implementations of a lot of your methods for you. The most important method is the start method. This is where it all happens. Notice that it takes a panel of type accepts one widget. So this is what enforces the requirement that an activity is responsible for managing one area of the screen. And then it also takes an event bus, which is the bus that your app uses to communicate with other parts of the app. So you call panel.setWidget with your view, and that then brings, that results in GWT calling addWidget to that container. So this is what actually makes your view show up on the screen. An ActivityMapper is what you use to tell GWT when this place transition happens, here's the activity to load. So it has only one method called getActivity. It takes a place. And your code will typically look something like this. If it's one type of place, then you return the corresponding activity. You'll have one activity mapper for each region of the screen, typically. We'll look at that in just a second. Okay, so a couple of activity mapper idioms here. Your code can return a new activity each time the getActivity method is called, in which case your activities are completely disposable. And this makes your code the cleanest because you're not having to clean up the state each time. Each time you're just getting a brand new activity and all the state is gone from previous views of that place. But you can also use a singleton activity where you might obtain it from dependency injection from Gen, let's say, or from your own factory. And in that case, you would just call an update method on your singleton activity and tell it about the new place. And then you have to do the state cleanup. Okay, so how does this all work together now? Places and activities. Let's say you call placeController.goTo. Again, it fires the place change event, which gets picked up by the activity manager. The activity manager asks your activity mapper what activity goes with this place, and then it calls the mayStop method on the old activity that was running in the area of the screen. If it allows it to stop, then the activity manager will start the new activity. The only piece that you write is the activity itself, of course, and the activity mapper. All these other classes are fundamental GWT classes. So how can you divide a screen into regions and have one place transition result in multiple activity transitions? Let's look at the right side of the screen first. We have the List Activity Manager and the Details Activity Manager on the top and bottom. These would be two different activities running in their respective panels. So each has its own manager, and each will have its own mapper. But there would only be one place change. So in this case, the URL would probably have something like detail record ID equals 34. And then all three of these things would be listening for the place change event and would make the transitions appropriately. So the two on the right are wired up with places and activities. So your activity mapper would say if place instance of detail place, then return new detail activity. And that would result in the bottom of the screen being updated. Similar for the top with the list activity. And then on the left side, this is a permanent feature of our screen. It doesn't actually change with respect to each place. The navigation is always there. So it doesn't even need to be an activity. It can just listen for place change events directly. That's why we have place change handler over there. You could make it an activity, but it doesn't really buy you anything. You just listen for the place change events and then update the UI showing a new selected item. So that's how you can have the notion of a composite place. You just have one place, but then you can have each activity respond to that place change. And this slide just summarizes that in words. So each region has its own activity manager and activity mapper. All the activity managers will get notified when the place changes. And then each activity can update its own region or view appropriately. So activities, I said, can be disposable. Places are disposable as well. They're designed to be throwaway objects. Each time a URL changes, that's going to be a new place object in your GWT code. Views, however, you don't want to make disposable typically for performance. Because view creation is expensive because you're touching the DOM in the browser. So the best idea is to have your activities obtain the views from some kind of factory, either dependency injection or a factory you create. And that way, you're minimizing the amount of time required to do that. Okay, now we come to code splitting. This is the good part. Right? This is why we are doing this new activities in places. We'd like to be able to defer code downloads until we actually need them. And this capability has been in GWT ever since 2.0, the gwt.runAsync. So you make a runAsync call, and anything in the onSuccess method will be deferred until it's actually encountered. The GWT compiler is actually very smart. It sees this construct in your code and then follows the call hierarchy from within the onSuccess method, and it packages everything that's called inside that onSuccess method into a separate JavaScript. And it only goes after that separate JavaScript when it's actually triggered. So a common thing to do is to break your application up into a tabbed panel interface, for example, and make each tabbed panel event handler call have the runAsync call that will end up with onSuccess getting called, and only then goes and loads the view for that panel. There's a class that not many people know about called the async proxy class in GWT that can help you with this because it can actually turn an async call into one that looks like a synchronous call. So if you use the async proxy, it can help you navigate some of the difficulty of the code here with runAsync. And I just want to point out that you can use the -compile report option in order to find out what the effectiveness of your runAsync splits has been. So you should always do this because you'll be surprised. Sometimes you think you're splitting code in a way that makes sense, and you'll find out you're actually not making much difference at all. So you run compile report and then look in the soyc report directory that it creates, and you'll get a nice view of how the total size of each split point. So how do we do code splitting with activities in places? Well, what we found on Google projects that have been using this is that an activity is a very natural split point. It turns out to be not too big, not too small, it's easy to understand, and it more or less corresponds to something the user is doing in the UI. So it's a good place. You might have, for example, in a multi-tabbed interface, each tab might have its own activity, and then you would split on the activity in order to defer download for that tab. So with Gen, you want to use the async provider class that's part of Gen, and it's actually being moved into, the interface is being moved into GWT as well, so you don't have a dependency on Gen necessarily. So your getActivity method in your mapper would probably have something like this. It would return the activity async provider.get. That's the standard method on the async provider. And that would then cause your activity to be loaded. Gen, if you use this approach, and why it's nice, is that Gen will generate the RunAsync call for you, so you don't even have to have that block. Now, if you want to do without Gen, then you're going to want to create a proxy class that's going to proxy the activity's start method. And so you would, whenever your activity proxy class start method gets called, then it would put in the RunAsync block, which would make the real call to obtain your activity. There is some work in progress on this still. If you look at issue 5129, there's extensive discussion about different possible approaches, and we're still looking at which one we're actually going to commit to the GWT trunk to make this a little easier. But you can write your own, and the recipes are all up there. It's just too detailed to put on a screen. Okay, lastly, let's look at some compiler tips. We hear quite often from people doing large projects that GWT projects can take several minutes to compile. Sometimes 10 or 20 minutes, really large projects using a lot of permutations, even larger. So the reason is because GWT creates permutations for each browser, which is custom JavaScript code specific for that browser, which is the most efficient code for that browser, because we've tweaked the JavaScript in order to know about the browser's particular idiosyncrasies and speed improvements that are possible, et cetera. Which is great for user experience, because the user gets the fastest experience they can. But it does mean that you're having additional compile time for your app. So one technique when you're using, prior to your final production compile, is just to set a single user agent property in your GWT XML, so you're only compiling one browser permutation for the one that you normally develop with. And as your project gets larger, you'll appreciate the benefit of this more. You can also do the same thing with locale, because permutations get multiplied together. So if you have 5 browser permutations and 4 languages or locales, that's going to result in 20 permutations. So if you're using multiple properties this way, you definitely want to be restricting them when you're doing your ordinary development compiles. Of course, I should say at the beginning, you shouldn't be compiling as a normal part of development. You should be using development mode when your changes take place right away. Avoid RPC type explosion. Just a reminder there as well. This is not something you can deal with easily in your GWT XML, except for the RPC blacklisting. But be thinking about it as you design your RPC interfaces. So these are a couple things to improve your compile time. Now, draft compile is an option that you can add, and it allows you to skip a lot of the optimizations. So you wouldn't want to use that for your final production compile, but this will typically, well, we'll show some numbers here in a second. Okay, so I've put together a simple little app, and this is where I do my eye candy demo. It's just got 12 classes, and I ran some different numbers. So let me just show you the app first so you can see a little bit what we're dealing with. It's called SpiroDraw. I like math, and I like polar coordinates. It was one of the things that got me into programming on the Apple IIe in 7th grade. So I made my high school Java students that I'm teaching this year do a little animation with polar coordinates so they could see these equations. So here we can change the numerator and denominator for, actually that last one looked pretty good, let's go with that. On the standard, r equals cosine n theta, and it draws it out. This is using GWT Canvas, and I'm really not supposed to be talking about this, I'm supposed to be talking about performance, but it's cool. And what's even cooler is this little gizmo, which we animated also with GWT Canvas, And you can come in here and set the wheel size and the colors to change the shape of the graph. And you probably had a toy like this when you were a kid and thought it was great, but you got annoyed with it whenever the paper would slip and it would make your drawings not beautiful anymore. Well, here the paper never slips, right? So you can enjoy it. So this is my little SpiroDraw app. It's spirodraw.appspot.com, and you can do that for the rest of the presentation if you get bored with me. So 12 classes, very simple app, but these are some numbers. I just went through and ran different combinations. So just a standard compile for all browsers was 43.3 seconds. If I did Safari only by restricting the user agent property, then that took it down to 27.7 seconds. If I do draft compile and Safari only, I could get it down to 24.1 seconds, so about half. So by just restricting the browser agent, which is a one-liner in your XML, and using the draft compile option, you can cut your compile time in half. And it'll be more dramatic the more permutations you have, of course. Note that the -compile report option takes it the other way. Because it's generating a lot of extra data for you, it will add time to your compile. So be careful when you're doing development. You don't want to do that every time through. OK, now that's how to speed up compiles. What about shrinking the resulting JavaScript? There's quite a few things you can do, some lesser-known options in GWT to do this. So one of them is called the -x disable class metadata. And this is an option you can pass to the compiler, which will cause the compiler to not generate some extra JavaScript that does just class cast checking. And if you're not using a lot of class cast checking in your code, or if you can tolerate class cast violations, basically, then you can use this and save some resulting size. Similar, sorry, I got my two methods mixed up. That was class cast checking. I was talking about class metadata. You have to be careful with this one because it will disable some methods. Like you can't call getName on your class if you've got this in here. So if you use these, they're considered -x. They're slightly experimental. You just want to make sure you test your app and make sure everything still works if you're using these options. And those will show up as a JavaScript in your exception in your browser. The compiler won't warn you if you're using these. It just won't work. OK, and then -compile report we already talked about puts the story of your compile in the extras directory. And that would allow you to see the largest packages because you can see the size of the JavaScript resulting from each Java package. So you could then see if there's anything that you could eliminate or maybe combine in order to not pay the tax for that package twice. Okay, some others here. We have some parameters you can put in your GWT XML. The compiler stack mode. Stack stripping, it's called, will remove a lot of info that can be used in client-side stack traces, and you can get up to a 15% reduction typically from this. There's also a new property put in to obfuscate the enum names. So if you use enum types in your app extensively, you might want to look at this. We're talking about bytes here. You know, if you have an enum that's like male, comma, female for gender, it's 4 bytes and 5 bytes. It's going to go down to 0, 1. So you're not going to save a whole lot of space, but if you use it a lot, you might save a little. We'll have a number on that here in a second. CSS resource obfuscation prefix. This is another thing you can do to shorten up the names when you're using client bundle and CSS resources. There's a couple of resources listed here you can look at. The GWT FAQ on our documentation site, as well as the file that's part of the GWT distribution, compiler parameters.gwtxml, has even more parameters that you can look at. These are the main ones that affect size and speed, though. OK, so what are the numbers for our different? Again, for our SpiroDraw app here, which does minimal casting and has only one enum, so we're not really testing those very heavily here. But we see we can get a few percent out of the -x options, 3.8% out of stack stripping, and if you put it all together, you can get a 7% reduction. Well, that's actually pretty sizable in this case, because we went from 280K down to 261K. If your app is a lot bigger and uses a lot more of these things, you could see anywhere from 15 to 20% reduction. It may give you a little extra boost on load time. So we've talked about speed. Why does it matter? Pitfalls, use cell widgets, use activities in places, compiler tips, I hope you've gotten some valuable information here. And thank you very much. Let me take some questions at the mics if anybody has any. Thank you. Yes?
Yeah, hi. I was wondering if one of you could speak a little bit more about sorting with cell table, because I'm converting to cell table from my own implementation, and I was able to get sorting working, but it seemed a little onerous, and I was wondering if there's any quick, easy, just 99% of the time I want alphanumeric on the contents, basically.
Okay.
So there's at its core, sorting is basically a column sort handler. I guess you've already discovered this. And there are a couple tricks you can do. So it's designed to work in two scenarios. One is when you sort, you can get a range change event if you're sending an RPC request to the server. And at that point, you basically send the sort info to the server, and the server can do the sorting. If you're doing it only on the client, you can use the list data provider, which is a Java util.list. And what you can do is you can associate a column with a comparator. And so that's the simplest it will get. You basically say when this column is sorted, use this comparator. And if it's reverse sorted, it will just use the comparator in reverse. And so you might want to look into that.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any documentation anywhere on the optimized levels in the compile?
I don't think there's any doc on specific levels.
Because it
You're
says
talking
like
about
0 to 9.
Right.
And is 9 better than 0, or is 0 better than 9?
Oh. I don't know. Which compiles faster?
Well, no, specifically around, like size of compile and all that type of thing. Is there any benefit of using, 9, or what's the default? Let's put it that way.
I believe the default is 9, and I believe that the draft compile option gives you 0.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think, in practice, I think most people just use draft compile. They don't worry about individual levels, because probably if you're using draft compile, you're wanting it to be compile as quickly as possible. And if you're compiling for production, you want as much optimization as possible. So practically, I don't think people actually use that. They just use draft compile.
Okay, because the reason I was asking is there was a post somewhere that said if you use like 4, it's like 20% smaller code creation than if you use 9. I don't know if that's true or if that's...
I could see that being true for 4 versus 9, but I would expect that 0 would be even... Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it was like
Yeah.
9 is larger than like
Okay,
4.
yeah.
Just curious.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that you should only create widgets in cases where you need events off those widgets. I'm wondering about HTML panels, because you said also that if you can, just use HTML, straight HTML, if you don't need to put events in there. But what if you were to create an HTML panel and then ID some element way down there and then add a widget to that? Do you get any benefits from that? Is that an optimization technique that you think might fly? Or
I think, do you know HTML panels still have some?
No, absolutely, but that is an optimization. In fact, if you're using UI Binder, that's the way most people use it, is they create the HTML panel, fill it with raw HTML, and just use widgets selectively. That's a big if you use that throughout your app. I mean, one is not going to make a difference, but if you use it throughout your app, that's significantly faster than using GWT panels throughout. So definitely.
okay, thanks.
Question over here, down the center aisle.
Okay, so I would have 2 questions. One is not certainly relevant, but what happened to Roo? That was a big thing last time, and I didn't hear anything about that.
I'm not aware of a lot of activity around Roo currently. I think some GWT folks, actually the Spring guy who is supposed to be working with that is here at the conference. So you might ask him what's going on with it. But that's Spring's department really, more than GWT.
Okay. The other one would be you told that it's a good idea to cache the views, but not the presenters. But
right.
could that not lead to some memory issues if you cache too many views? Because then somehow it's cached in the memory, like all the widgets and stuff.
I suppose if you had hundreds or thousands of views, that you could end up eating some memory that way. But when I say cache the views, I'm not talking about loading them all at once necessarily, but just the first time they get loaded, then you keep them around as essentially singletons rather than creating new instances every time the place changes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, over here.
So I really appreciated in this session the breakdown of activities, places, views and presenters, and kind of seeing how you could take pieces and make up a page. And then in an earlier presentation, you talked about views and presenters being used for mobile. Could I convince you to take these sample applications and create a mobile version of it so that we can see how activities, places, views, presenters can be put together for your desktop and then for mobile?
Yeah, take a look at the expenses sample. Actually, there's a mobile version of that already.
Excellent.
And I think it uses activities in places. I'm not positive.
Actually, the mobile web app sample is even better. The newest sample it's exactly what you're talking about. It uses activities in places, and the activity is the presenter, and we have different views for tablet, mobile, and desktop. So basically, it will detect which device you're on and serve you the view, but the 90% of the code that's like above the view logic is all completely shared.
And so what I'm wondering about is on the desktop, you're going to want to have all the pieces together. And then on the phone, for example, those pieces that are all together on the desktop will end up being different pages, right?
It's the same places, but they look different.
Okay.
So for example, on the desktop, I'll tell you what the versions look like. On the desktop, you have a menu and you click the task list or add task. If you haven't seen the app, it's a task manager. And so you have a task list that's a table, a cell table, and then you have add task, it's a form, and you can switch between them. On the mobile version, it's similar, except you have a list of tasks, and each item has, sort of it has a name and a date under it. And when you click one, it slides over, and the form is more vertical for a mobile. And then on the tablet, it's got them a split screen. So you have the list always visible and the task on the side. And it even supports things like rotating the mobile device in the tablet.
Excellent. That sounds exactly like what I'm wondering about. Thanks.
That code is located right here. I've got it up on it's under the in trunk samples mobile web app. Question from this mic?
Yeah, so cells are awesome from a performance perspective, but they don't really compare to widgets in terms of being able to add styles and attributes and basically muck with them very dynamically. And given that cells kind of seem to be the future with the new widgets and all of this, do you think we'll ever get cells to a point where it doesn't require a brand new cell implementation with inner HTML stuff and your own dispatching stuff just to add something that the cell up front did not? Most of them will sometimes take style name, but nothing really other than that. If you know what I mean.
Yeah, the first set of cells were very rudimentary, and we intentionally didn't expose any styles so that we could add them later, because if we exposed them now, we'd be stuck with them. So the answer is yes, we plan to expand the library and to focus on client bundle and CSS resources. So they'll be a little bit more difficult, admittedly, they'll be more difficult to style because you have to specify your styles in a CSS resource. But when you do that, the GWT compiler can optimize those and obfuscate the names. So it actually gives you a performance benefit. And so over time, we're going to expand that library and make it more customizable. And we're following a pattern. The only one in there now is the button widget has been modified, or the text button. But we're following a pattern where it's we gwt.create all of the resources and the view version of that, the appearance pattern we call it. And so what that means is that third parties can provide skins that not only replace the styles, but the actual DOM structure. So your button can go from being a button element to some nested divs to whatever else you want. And we're hoping that takes off, but we have not yet really started to expand that library.
Sure. I perhaps overemphasized style and what I was talking about. Widgets are also just very, since they're stateful, it's very easy to intuitively, modify them, adding children, removing children, setting things that aren't style related like titles or values or whatever. It's just a very stateful, intuitive model that I don't quite see yet in cells, but would definitely like to. Obviously, I understand you don't have state, so that
Yeah.
I think it's, if I can speak to that, I think it's pretty much implicit in the flyweight pattern. If you're writing out HTML, it's going to be ugly. But that's how you get the performance benefit associated with the cell widgets.
And one thing that's coming down the pipe is a UI binder for cells. So that will help a lot. So instead of having to construct the HTML from a object using a string builder or safe HTML builder, you can just put it into a UI binder XML file and sort of write the raw HTML and then replace parts with the values that you want to replace. So that should help.
Question over here?
Yeah, we started to use cell table, and it's nice and very easy to use, and also has custom column, so you can create your own column type. And but we have some problem with alignment. I don't know it's the way we didn't use it properly, or because some column want to align to the left, some to the right, and it works in some browser and doesn't work in other browsers. Is a known issue, or is something we didn't do right?
The text aligns in different sides?
Yes, alignment for the column.
By default, we don't adjust alignment, so the browser just chooses the alignment. It may vary between browser, and they may even do creative stuff like move numbers over to one side, but text over to the other.
Exactly.
But there is in a column, have you tried using the set alignment?
Yes, we tried, but
Did it work?
It worked in some browser, but
Okay.
it doesn't work.
You can file a bug, we'll take that should fix it in all browsers.
Okay. My other question is related to the activities. We started to use that as well. And the warning, pop-up is very nice when the user want to, when they click the back button. But sometimes we want to pop up a new window. And for example, pop up a new window to an external URL. And that warning also pops up. Is any, bypass or workaround with that? We don't want to show that pop up when they try to open a new window, go to another URL.
You have the onMayStop method where you provide your warning message. So you could override that method and make it, set some kind of flag in there that it could look at to determine whether or not you wanted to show the message. Because if you return true from, you would be looking at the, it's onMayStop, I think. If you return true from that, then it will let it go ahead and stop, and it won't pop any warning message at all.
Give example, on your screen, maybe you have a button to click, and that will open up a new pop-up window, go to an external URL. Mm-hmm. We didn't leave this page anyway, but the pop-up and the warning, comes out and asks you, do you want to stay and do you want to leave? Is any workaround for that? Or?
Yeah, no, I can't remember which method it is exactly, but I think it's onMayStop.
Okay.
In the activity, and if you return the right thing, it's either null or true or something like that, but then it will allow it to stop without putting up any kind of a warning message.
Okay, I look into it. Thank you.
Question?
When I've inspected some of the JavaScript that's generated, how it kind of goes shortest method to longest method. There seems to be an awful lot of methods that are just empty. Not sure if that's just some coding style that just seems to be pervasive in projects that I've seen them in, but I noticed this 40 just totally empty methods, and I'm thinking there's probably got to be some compiler setting that gets rid of those. I don't know if maybe they're there as an obfuscation technique to sort of throw people off. I don't really know, but I do notice them consistently in there, and I wonder if that's something that we can get rid of. I mean, it's like 3 characters or 4 characters a piece, so it's not huge, but there are 40 or 50 of them. So does that sound familiar at all? Do you see that?
I remember seeing an issue on this on the issue tracker, actually. Did you file that issue?
No.
Okay. So someone else has observed it.
Good.
And I don't remember I don't remember the details, honestly. I know it's out there. You might see whatever our responses were on that issue. But it has been pointed out before.
I haven't looked in 2.3.0, but I mean about 2.1 and 2.2, I noticed them. But.
Yeah, I think there are some pathological cases where that happens. And we're trying not to do that ordinarily. But yeah, without looking at the actual code, whatever, it's hard to say.
Okay, thanks.
Yes.
So closely related to code splitting is the ability to defer loading of third-party JavaScript libraries. Is there any thought to providing that API, or did I miss it?
I don't think we have that,
Okay.
obviously.
Yeah.
Have you thought about it?
What you're basically talking about is a script widget, if you will, with a load handler. I mean, that's what it would amount to. And it's not on anybody's radar as far as I know, but if it would be useful, it's probably something that could be done.
Yeah.
You-
In our case, the third-party library is larger than our app, and we use it in less than 20% of the time. So there are cases where it would be very useful.
Do you want, if you just want to defer the loading of it, you can use RunAsync, and in your RunAsync call, well, that's not really what you want. I mean, yeah, I'm not sure. I don't have a good answer. I'd be making stuff up. So.
Last question
Now
over here.
to,
Yep.
to this RunAsync topic. So you mentioned we can inject it with gin, like to annotate it. And what happens if it cannot load? Is there some error handling for that?
Yes, you also provide an on-failure method in your RunAsync block.
Oh.
And the on-failure method, then you control what happens.
Okay, I also didn't get that. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much.